Hello and welcome to the first episode of DRADIS Contact, the unofficial Battlestar Galactica the board game podcast. We're your hosts, Nick and AJ, and in this podcast we aim to celebrate and promote this beloved board game.
So in this episode we want to introduce our podcast, discuss what motivated us to start doing this, and give our top 10 tips for getting the best experience out of a first game of Battlestar Galactica, either a game that you're playing for yourself or if you're introducing the game to a new group for the first time.
I'm guessing if you're listening to this podcast, it probably means you're already well aware of this amazing board game. Just on the off chance you're not, and you've stumbled onto this podcast, what we're going to do is quickly give you an overview of Battlestar Galactica. This isn't a rules teach. There's some great videos out there that can do that. For now, this is just a bit of an overview of what the game entails. So, in 2003, there was a rebooted television series of Battlestar Galactica by Ronald D. Moore and David Icke. And Fantasy Flight Games in 2008 developed a board game based on that property. And it was developed by a designer called Corey Konieczka. Corey Konieczka is I would call him an alchemist designer. He's very good at taking disparate elements and bringing them together. So a theme with a mechanism you never would have thought would be paired together, or with different types of mechanism. And, you know, for fans of this game, we'd say that he probably struck lightning with Battlestar Galactica. And I think he did with a couple of his games as well. The game itself, it's a very intense and immersive experience if you're willing to put yourself into it. There's a lot of the strategy, there's cooperation, there's hidden agendas. You have to ostensibly work together to ensure the survival of humanity in the theme of Battlestar Galactica, while at all times grappling with the threat of treachery and betrayal from within. What the game does really well is it excels at capturing that tension and the paranoia that was on the television show. And it gives rise to these really thematically deep and deep moments and a real rich narrative. So what you're going to do is you're going to take on the role of one of the iconic characters from the show, initially 10 in the base game, and it's expanded up more in the expansions, each one with their unique skills and abilities. And what you'll do over the course of 3 or 4 hours is navigate various crises, combat Cylon assaults that come on the ship, and while trying to maintain all the resources that your fleet has to hold on to, while trying to make your way to the first waypoint of the show, which was Kobol at the end of the first season. One of the key standout features of the game, and what really sets it apart from traditional traitor games, is the loyalty mechanism. So you're given your loyalty, be it human or Cylon, at the beginning of the game. However, at the midpoint of the game, in what's called the sleeper phase, you're given a second loyalty card. What that does is it can actually change your loyalty. So what that forces you to do is not play too hard on the human team in the first half of the game, if you receive a You Are Not a Cylon card, and instead be ready to switch teams at the midpoint to go for the win.
I think that's such a brilliant design decision, isn't it? Because it just really kind of encourages that slight element of selfish play, and it makes it really hard to read what other people around the table are doing. People are slightly hedging their bets, or they're doing something that's kind of inscrutable, and you're like, why are they doing that? That doesn't make any sense. And it just introduces enough fuzziness into the system.
Absolutely. You have to play it for yourself. You have to be looking to, much like the show, make sure you're grasping enough power for yourself. You're holding your titles. There's characters in the show who were never Cylons or even Cylon affiliated, but were nonetheless antagonists, because they were trying to usurp the power in the fleet for themselves to make sure that they would end out in front. And you've got to do the same in the game. So yeah, this deception adds this layer of complexity to the gameplay, this atmosphere of suspicion, as you said, Nick, that it permeates everything. And it means that every decision, and the mechanisms are great at reinforcing this, every decision that players make can be questioned by the other players, because nothing quite seems completely altruistic in any scenario. And it's a wonderfully replayable experience, because, especially with a similar group, because you remember things that happened in previous games.
Yeah, I mean, I think every game that we've played has felt somewhat different to the others, and we've played with a variety of different expansions. But just in terms of the narrative that we've built and the way the game has unfolded, and the kind of the decisions we've had to kind of make together and the problems we had to overcome, it just feels very different each and every time. I think another great thing I love about this game is that even when it's not on your turn, there's still stuff for you to be involved in, and you have to kind of keep an eye on what's happening around the table. So even though it's not your player's turn, you still feel engaged with the game at all times.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's often where a lot of your input can happen. You only get one movement and one action on your turn, but actually throughout the way you interact on other people's turns, whether it be negotiation or contribution to skill checks, there's always a way that you're engaged. Yeah, so I'd say, even though I don't consider this to be a traitor game in the traditional sense, because it's not a game that you play cooperatively and then someone betrays you. It's actually a game where you are always out for yourself, and often where the teams that are actually going to form aren't fully clear at the beginning of the game. It's a hidden team game, really. But anyway, if you're a fan of cooperative games, traitor games, strategic games, or even just Battlestar Galactica the series, I would say to you that the board game is an incomparable experience that I'd highly recommend.
Yeah, I mean, I entirely agree with that. I think the other key thing about it is that it's kind of quite dynamic in terms of its pacing. So you'll have periods of time when it's kind of non-stop action, but then you'll also have periods of time when there's less action happening and there's more time for sort of the political machinations and the kind of the diplomacy element of the game to come out. And I find that really, really interesting, that it's not a game solely about conflict and combat. There can be other space for other decisions to be made.
And this is something we'll get into a lot more later on as we start talking about expansions. That change in pace is something that some players don't like and actually feel that some of the expansions fixed. And actually, much like you're alluding to there, that's something I like about the base game, where there are actually some rounds where very little is happening from an external threat perspective. And it gives that time, that breathing space for the internal conflicts between you and the power grabbing between you as players to act a bit selfishly.
I think I'm naturally sort of drawn to games where they offer like slightly different ways to play the game. You can be a pilot, you can be out there, shooting down raiders if you wish, or you can be the admiral, or you can be the president, controlling the quorum. To me, like any kind of game that gives you that variety of play styles, I just love that.
And I don't think there's obviously my preferences. I don't think there's a single one of those aspects I wouldn't enjoy. Like if one game I'm the admiral, if one game I'm the president, if one game I'm a pilot, or even a support character in some cases, they're all fun in their own way.
Yeah, I think even if you're not a fan of the show, like there's a lot of fun to be had in some of the mild role-playing elements you discussed earlier, isn't it? So in terms of the character that you choose, the way that you play them, the responsibilities that you take, you can have fun just inhabiting that role. Okay,
so that's a bit of an overview of the game. Nick, do you want to kick us off with a bit of an overview of the podcast and what inspired us to take this on?
Yeah, sure. So basically we were motivated to do this because Battlestar Galactica has been falling down the Board Game Geek Top 100 ratings for a while now. And in fact, on the recent Shut Up and Sit Down podcast, Tom Brewster, as one of his predictions for the coming year, he predicted that Battlestar Galactica would fall out of the Board Game Geek Top 100. At the moment, it's perilously close to doing so. So what we thought we'd try and do is put together a podcast that sort of celebrates this great game, tries to sort of raise people's awareness of it, and prevent the game, falling into obscurity. I think the thing with board games is, like, unlike computer games, they're not sort of subject to these extinction style events where, like, a particular platform becomes unsupported or the software becomes unusable. In the case of Battlestar Galactica, I suppose the one sort of equivalent is that it is getting harder to find a copy. The game is no longer in production. You'd have to sort of source a copy secondhand. But, there is like a natural attrition, I suppose. So, newer games are released, they're promoted, and they kind of enter in the Board Game Geek Top 100. And I guess there is like an attrition, and some of these older games do fall by the wayside. But, for me, like, I don't want to see it drop out the top 100. I think, no game that I've played sort of so perfectly melds its theme and the game mechanics. And it's just been such a source of joy for me playing it over and over again. So I really want to promote the game, keep it alive for as long as we can, encourage people that have the game but not played it yet to dust off their copies, give it a go, seek out a copy if they've heard about it and they want to give it a go but weren't sure, they were, wanted a bit of rule support. We're here to provide that and just basically give people the best possible game experience. What we plan to do is cover all aspects of Battlestar Galactica, the board game, including how it plays at different player counts. There's been a multitude of expansions released for the game, and we'll kind of go through how they interact with one another. And it's also indeed spawned a series of spin-off games, which we're going to dissect, discuss, compare, and review in future episodes. Each episode of the podcast will have a news segment. We'll talk updates, and then we'll have a headline feature that we'll do a sort of a deeper dive on. One key aspect of the podcast is that we want engagement from our fans and from the community. We're going to have a number of different ways in which you can contact us, either through Board Game Geek or through social media. And what we really want to do is hear your voices. We want you to vote or comment on upcoming topics, or come on and speak to us directly. Tell us about your experience of the game, your opinions of what works. If you dislike something we're saying, please, we'd love to have you on and talk it through.
Absolutely. Something I'm very grateful for is there's a great community on Board Game Geek for this game. And there's some people on there who've played the game. I think there's one guy who's played the game 800 times, which I'm incredibly jealous of. But they've a lot of them hold very strong opinions about the best way to play. Certain expansions, certain modules, even house rules. And I think what I'd like to provide is a platform, not for us to tell people how we think is the best way to play, although you're probably going to hear that from us anyway, but a platform for the community to talk about different ways to play the game and put their point of view forward.
So each week we're going to start the news section with Battlestar Galactica's current Board Game Geek ranking. And I've got to say, it's currently, as we record this at the end of June, it's currently in 99th position. When Tom Brewster first made his prediction, it was sitting at 95, so it's already dropped 4 places, which means that we've really got our work cut out. It's been leapfrogged by a few recent entries into the top 100, including Dune Imperium Uprising. So yeah, it's facing some stiff competition.
It's very difficult for an old game like this to maintain its position, because it's going to be swimming upstream the entire time. You're competing against new games coming in every year and games that are more accessible. And we're looking at here a game that is not only out of print by its original publisher, but is also based on an IP that is looking at, started 20 years ago, the reimagined television series. So we're certainly got to work it out for us, as you rightly said. So the only other piece of news for today is that we've had the release of the first expansion for Unfathomable. It's called From the Abyss. Unfathomable is actually the re-implementation of Battlestar Galactica by Fantasy Flight Games. In future episodes, we'll talk a lot more about the extent to which it is a re-implementation of Battlestar Galactica, the board game. Certainly some of the mechanisms are recognisable. The game overall plays the same. I would argue the feeling is quite different, but that's something we'll get into. From the Abyss is bringing in new playable characters, new Mythos cards, and some new features, such as new one they're bringing in called Horrors, which is a new type of monster, new allies, boon skill cards, and something they're called Prelude cards, which are adjusting the difficulty of the game during setup. All looking like interesting modules, but very much continuing the divergence from Battlestar Galactica. And that's something we'll talk about more when we talk about Unfathomable. It's certainly, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, it's forging its own design philosophy. And the expansion appears to be continuing that, rather than trying to bring it back towards BSG or one of its expansions.
Yeah, so in our headline feature of this first episode, we want to talk about your first game of Battlestar Galactica. Okay, and so with that in mind, we're going to give you what we have distilled down as our top 10 tips. I think one of the key things, actually, that we probably need to get across is that Battlestar Galactica is not a game for everyone.
Yeah, it's certainly tempting to say that anyone who doesn't enjoy the game probably hasn't been taught it correctly or hasn't had the right experience. But at the end of the day, that's not true. It's not going to be a game that everyone enjoys. Not everyone likes games with hidden information. Not everyone likes a game with ostensibly a traitor mechanic in it. So, but what I would say is I think that there are, from my knowledge, people who have had a very bad first experience with this game because of it being taught badly. And those are players who I think we could probably convert, or in some cases, I think we could prevent that from happening with just a few pointers. Give people just a little bit of information that would help them ensure that first game is as good as it can be and get people hooked into the game.
One of the key things that's really worked well for our group is to establish a single person who is responsible for teaching the game. And they have to really have a good enough handle on the rules to be able to answer any questions as they may come up. So ideally, you want this person to be somebody who's played the game before, or even better yet, a really experienced player, someone who's had time to go through the rules and access the frequently asked questions and really is abreast of all of the rules, basically.
You're absolutely right. And one of the reasons that's very important is because there is information that has to be taught correctly and is very difficult to check partway through the game without breaking some of the information that needs to be hidden. So someone who knows the game very well and is accustomed to teaching it will understand how to convey the correct information during setup and ensure that everyone has enough information to play the game without asking questions that would give away hidden information. The second tip to move on to is just ensuring that players understand what the game actually is. I think a lot of times the game might be pitched as a cooperative game with a traitor, as we talked about earlier. I think it's better pitched as a hidden team game, where everyone should be playing selfishly for their own position, for their own power. It's not necessarily about going all in for the humans and then being shocked and appalled when one player betrays everyone. I think encouraging people to think of themselves as an individual within the game, thematically, and to play selfishly, it would ensure that people have a better experience.
The third thing I wanted to mention is I think you have to go into it kind of accepting the fragility of the game. I think it's fair to say that Battlestar Galactica is not a bulletproof experience out of the box. Games can fall flat. There's a few mechanics that can lead to the game ending quite sort of abruptly, such as, and we'll talk about these in more detail in future episodes, but, for people that are in the know, getting brig locked, or if an inexperienced Cylon player reveals themselves too early, some of the jeopardy is lost. But to my mind, although that risk of fragility is inherent to the game, the reward side of that is the potential for just incredibly, rich thematic experiences that hasn't really been matched by any other game that I've played. So for me personally, going into it knowing that the game could occasionally be a dud, it's still worth it every time.
Yeah, and that can put people off, that it's not bulletproof. You really can have a bad game. You can have games that are so obvious the way they're going that you'll have players advocating a concession, usually on behalf of the humans, in a brick lock situation like the one you mentioned or in some others. But I think fragility is the price of entry for a game that can give you an unbelievably in-depth and positive game experience. You've got to accept that 1 in 20 games, let's say, could be a complete dud, and you move on to something else. And the reason you have to get everyone's behind that is it's not a 15-minute game. It is possible that in 1 in every 20 games, you'll have spent 3 hours and got nowhere, and you have to pack up the box and play something else. It might happen.
And if that's the only game you had time for that evening, I could see that be quite frustrating for
Absolutely.
a group. So,
yeah. And you can see why it'd be tempting for players to say, well, let's bring out something that is so well designed and so tight that it's bulletproof, and you already know how the game's going to flow. But I would argue that a game like that can only reach a certain height, certainly for someone who enjoys thematic games. And the fourth point we have for you is really kind of building upon that idea of fragility. And this is teaching how to handle hidden information very carefully, especially to new players. I would dedicate a lot of time to this in the teach. I think I've even gone back over it after I've taught the game a few times and spent another 5 minutes talking about hidden information, when it will be given, what you can share and what you can say in any given situation. And that might seem like overkill, and obviously you don't want to burden the teach too much. You don't want to be spending a lot of time talking at people before they're allowed to play the game. This is so important, it's worth going back over, especially how the Cylon reveal process works. That once you understand that you are a Cylon, how you are then able to use an action to reveal yourself, and in some cases have a severe impact on the fleet, on the other players. It's just really important to explain a couple of times and make sure people understand that, so they don't have to stop you in the middle of the game and say, oh, my card says I'm a Cylon, how do I do this?
Yeah, I think the fifth point again sort of follows on quite neatly from that, and that's, if at all possible, it's well worth investing in some player aids. Now, the back of the rulebook, of which there's one copy obviously in the game, is a reasonably good player aid for the base game only, but there is some information missing from that. And it's information that players may wish to confirm that they can't easily access and check, such as you say, what the precise text is on their face down, you are a Cylon card. That's obviously going to be a very powerful action when they reveal it, but they wouldn't have a reason to check it unless they are a Cylon. So you've got to be really careful with making sure people are well set up as you say, with information at the start of the game, or better yet, in addition to that, have access to a player guide such that they can kind of surreptitiously check things and make their own game plan in their mind without revealing their intentions to those around the table.
Something I like about the back of the rulebook for the base game is it's got some key bits of information, and then there's a small section that talks about, that gives you reference pages to go back into the rulebook if you need to know something else. So you could quickly reference something yourself. I think it's just some situations where you might want to be careful not to show the other players which page you're reading. Sure, because that may give away what you're planning and what your
intention is. Yeah,
exactly. Okay, point number 6 is going to be controversial, and that's to initially, with your group, or certainly with new players, play the base game only. Now, there's some people who are going to shout me down, say we're mad for suggesting this, because there are elements of the expansions that many players feel fix the base game to an extent where the base game is broken in some opinions. I'm not of that opinion. I think that the vast majority of the experience you want to get of this game is in the base game. And that I would not say that any of the expansions are essential. There are going to be some situations we talk about in another episode about expansions where you really will benefit from having them. But certainly for a first game with new players, just stick with the base game and just enjoy it for what it is without any modifications.
Yeah, I think to follow on that, having played a number of times with expansions, we played recently, didn't we, with just the base game again. And it was a real revelation to study the cards in your hand and to see kind of the power of the action cards that you have in some of the skill cards that you draw. I think, it's obviously a very well designed experience of the base game. And sometimes in some of the expansions, some of that can be lost a little bit, can't it? So tip number 7 is going to basically be that if at all possible, you should try and assemble 5 players to play this game. That's because, although it can be played at other player counts, Battlestar Galactica is finely tuned to be played at 5 players, where you will often end up with, when everyone's revealed their loyalties, a team of 3 humans and 2 Cylons. Every other player count basically compromises one or more elements of the game in order to achieve that player count. And it can be through Cylon leader cards, through mutineers, through other roles effectively. But really, the best possible game experience is just met at 5 players.
Completely agree. If you can, always aim for 5 on this game. The other player counts all offer something, and the expansions have tried to offer ways to make them more playable. Certainly the 4 and 6 player experience has received multiple attempts at making it more playable in the expansions. I think it still plays well with the options in the base game for 4 and 6 players, but nothing beats the 5 player experience, where there are 2 Cylon cards in the loyalty deck, meaning that you can have a revealed Cylon and a hidden Cylon, and in some situations you may have a Cylon who can turn another player into a Cylon by giving them the other Cylon card. Sure. And those kind of experiences only come out of that 5 player experience.
I mean, that's not to say that the game is bad at other player counts. Like, I've enjoyed it at every player count I've played at, but I think particularly if you're going to be giving it, your first ever go, really sings at 5.
Yeah, agreed. Yes, I wouldn't avoid playing the game at the other player counts, but just aim for 5 on your first game if you can. Okay, the next one for me, another perhaps controversial one. Point number 8: no house rules. So I'm not a fan of house rules in general anyway, in any board game. I'm generally the opinion that a board game, the most valuable thing you buy in a board game is a good set of rules that have been well play tested and thought out by the designer. And I don't like playing with those rules and modifying things. So you won't find me playing with house rules in anything. So take my advice here with a pinch of salt and understand the bias I have there. But I really don't think they're needed in Battlestar Galactica, especially in a first game scenario. And some of the things that people do house rule in the base game, I can understand. There's some people on Board Game Geek who make strong points about why you need to house rule some things in the base game. Let's talk about whether that's true or not in a future episode. For now, I'd say whether that's true or not, it is certainly not necessary in a first game experience.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think you and I are kind of similar in that regard. My natural sense of justice is just like, hang on, this is how the game designer intended it to be played. Let's just play it the way that they've written it down. Our next tip is going to be to just limit your exposure. If you're going into it for the first time, it's unfortunately now through into the fact that it's out of print. It's an expensive game. It's hard to get your hands on a copy. You don't have to go all in straight away. So if you can, play a friend's copy, go to a convention, take it out of the games library, play it at a local board game cafe, or, pick up a second-hand copy. You don't have to invest huge amounts of money to begin with. The base game alone is a phenomenal experience, and that will tell you and your group if the game is for you. So just don't overcommit initially. Don't go mad. Just start with the base game.
And I think the good news about the game is if you look after the copy, whatever you go for, if you buy a second-hand copy, or even if you buy one that's slightly in better condition, you'll generally be able to get your money back, I think, if you look after it.
Yeah.
You'll be able to sell it on at a similar price if your game group decides it's not for you.
Yeah, I think they do. Yeah, as you say, they do hold their value, don't they? And we've been to a few conventions recently and seen copies being, exchanged there at the marketplace.
Last point then, point number 10, guide new players in their character choice. So I would not prescribe players with characters or with roles in the fleet. But in order to give people the best possible experience, I would give general advice before going into the game. And one of the things I'd really like to do, and Nick and I have had good experience doing this, is encourage people to pick some of the more powerful positions in the fleet. So pick the admiral or the president. So let's talk about the base game. Pick Adama and Roslyn if you're a new player, because not only are you getting to experience your character, but you're also getting to experience the choices and the options that become available as those powerful roles, and other things that happen in the game will become clear through doing that.
And just sort of to echo that, I think I've had great experiences introducing new players to the game where I've naturally sort of picked a support character, one that I maybe wouldn't naturally be drawn to. And you see a different facet of the game. You're drawing slightly different cards, you have a slightly different role, slightly different strengths. So actually in doing so, you can still learn a lot about the game yourself and see a different side to the game, and which keeps it really fresh and interesting for all concerned.
It's a great point. I'm very happy to pick the chief and run around repairing stuff. If the new players can enjoy playing as Adama and Roslyn, making big decisions. We had a great experience recently teaching a friend of yours where he picked the president. He picked a character I'll help the presidential line succession started as president. Was drawing into the quorum deck, which is a powerful deck of cards that you draw into as the president, and he quickly understood the power of doing so, and certainly that we were trying to encourage him to look for a particular card, which obviously he told us he was, and actually it turned out that he had actually realised very quickly what was going on, and once he found out he was a Cylon, was able to use that to his advantage and unlock a lot of us in the brig. So yeah. It's good to have those experiences.
Yeah, it was great to see him work that out, that he had the presidential pardon card in this instance that would have let somebody out of the brig. He had it early on, I think, and he was effectively just treading water, drawing more and more quorum cards. To us, it looked like he was trying to assist us, but of course, secretly, he was just killing time, running the clock down. Fantastic.
And I think that was his first game, and he's been pushing us again for another game as soon as possible. So
yeah, I think he had such a good experience. I mean, he's that kind of person. I don't think he'll mind me saying that he delighted in being a Cylon, and it worked out really nicely that he got to experience it in that way for his first ever game.
So that was our top 10 tips about how to get the best out of your first game or another player's first game of BSG. Something I would always keep in mind is that getting a new player to have a good time in this game it's a 50-50 experience. It's a symbiotic relationship. Half of it is them coming into the game being someone who enjoys this type of board games, which they might not be, and someone who's willing to kind of reach out for the experiences that we're talking about. And the other half of it is the group that's bringing that player in, being inviting, being accommodating, teaching the game well, and ensuring they have a good time. There are going to be scenarios where if someone doesn't like board games, or someone doesn't like complex board games, or someone doesn't like science fiction, then this might not be the game for them, because half of that equation isn't there. And likewise, there might be someone who is willing to have that experience, but the group just isn't ready to teach the game well or accommodate someone new and give them a good experience. When they're both there, when both those sides of that equation are there, you can really have a fantastic time.
Yes, I totally agree with you. And I think the other thing that this game does so well is that if you have a new player that's slightly unsure about what to do, well, there's sort of a space for shared decision making. So, you don't have to say to them, well, what cards have you got in your hand? Of course, nothing like that, but just within the locations on the board, within some of the actions they have available to them through their their titles and whatnot, together you can kind of construct what might be a good step for them. So actually, it's quite an inviting game in that sense. You can talk it through around the table and try and guide new players in that way. And there's a lot of fun, to be had in doing that.
And you're naturally protected, I think, from alpha gaming that you would find in a purely competitive game, purely cooperative game, wherein one player, sometimes an experienced player, will inform every other player around the table what should be done to ensure a win. Having hidden loyalty really helps with that. And that's actually where, from my understanding, traitor games came from. There was a game called Shadows over Camelot that came out that had the possibility of a hidden traitor. And the reason that was in that game was to stop people alpha gaming the cooperative experience.
Okay.
Because it meant that there was always the chance that one of the players was actually not acting on behalf of the group. And what it meant was you should never listen to someone else without questioning them. And that it naturally comes out of this game for the same reason.
Yeah, I think, again, as you say, with it being a hidden team game, it's the kind of game where if you've got a vast experience of the game, you'll understand some of its systems, you'll understand sort of maybe the card distribution and whatnot, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're any more likely to be on the winning team. There's still an awful lot to play for. So, you can have fun with this game at a variety of different experience levels, provided that you're prepared to, just accept basically and help guide newer players on that journey.
Something I like to do when it's someone's first turn of their first game is just say, here's all the things you could do. What do you think, Admiral? And give them the option, according with their rank and position, and give them the authority that this is down to you. And then even if they do something that is suboptimal, let them do it.
Yeah.
And let's see what happens. Yeah.
It's not the kind of game, is it, where the win or loss is going to hinge on a single action. Probably not, anyway. We've had very tight games, but there is space, isn't there, I think, for people to kind of just feel their way through their first turns. I mean, having said that, whenever we play with a particular friend of ours, he always nukes on turn one. It's become known as the Saxby maneuver, and that's an incredibly powerful move to clear any silence that are directly in your path. But yeah, you don't have to do that.
No, if he's the Admiral and there was anyone to nuke on the first turn of the game, he's doing it. And there's an argument for that. And even if it's not strategically optimal, it's a fun moment in the game.
Yeah, absolutely. And it certainly takes the heat off you in terms of space combat, isn't it? When you're so far from a jump cycle, and maybe people are just trying to sort of feel out what they're going to do next. They haven't maybe got very cards in hand. It seems to work in our group. So if you've listened this far, then thank you so much for joining us. As we mentioned earlier in the podcast, we really love the community to get involved and engage with us wherever possible. And to that end, we'll be starting threads on Board Game Geek with the DRADIS Contact prefix, so it's us, to discuss topics for upcoming episodes.
And if you'd like to engage with us directly, or come onto the show and explain why everything we talked about is right, wrong, indifferent, irrelevant, then you can contact me through my Board Game Geek account. My username is AJ_800. There's going to be a profile link in the description, and you can contact me through there.
Alternatively, you'll also find us on Twitter, where we're under the handle @DRADIS_Contact. Please do give us a follow on there. We'll be posting links and upcoming episode information. And of course, you can use Twitter to send us a direct message. We'd love to hear from you. Please drop us a line.
So I think that wraps up our first episode. Thank you. We've been AJ and Nick. This has been DRADIS Contact. And thank you for joining us.